Why is there a key taped to this crumbling motel door labeled Room 7? Eleanor Brooks held it in her trembling hand, the metal cold and slightly rusted, as if it had waited decades for her fingers alone. Around her, faded paint peeled from the walls, the smell of old carpet mingling with the scent of dust and rotting wood. The inheritance was a joke to everyone. $1, a single key, and this decrepit motel that no banker or neighbor valued. Yet in her pocket, the creased deed whispered of ownership, a tether to a past her family had tried to erase. The key felt heavier than it had any right to be, a small artifact promising secrets and danger in equal measure. 3 days earlier, Eleanor had walked out of the courthouse, a cardboard box clutched in one arm, a rusted 2002 Ford Explorer under her, and a checking account hovering at $211. The attorney's words still echoed. Room 7, and only Room 7, contains your grandfather's instructions. She drove the winding roads through town, tires crunching over gravel, past shuttered diners and gas stations, clutching her box with a mug chipped along the rim, an old photo album, and the deed to the motel her grandfather had bought in 1978. Every turn of the steering wheel, every bump in the road reminded her of what she'd lost. Respect, a home of her own, a sense that she mattered to anyone at all. The motel loomed ahead, white paint faded to gray, windows cracked, blinds swaying in a wind that made the sign creak like a moan. Eleanor parked, heart hammering, and took the key from her coat pocket, running her thumb along the grooves. She noticed a faint scratch beneath the number 7, almost like a fingerprint left long ago. The smell of mold and aged varnish filled her nose as she stepped toward the entrance, her boots crunching over broken glass and gravel. No one else lingered. Neighbors had long ago given up this property to history, to weeds, to time. But Eleanor felt eyes on her nonetheless, though the street was empty, the wind just stirring the dry leaves. She knelt by the door, testing the lock. It resisted, groaning, then shifted. Inside, the dark hallway stretched, shadows pooling in the corners where ceiling tiles had fallen and rats had left tracks in dust. Her breath came shallow, her fingers brushing the key, feeling its weight as both promise and threat. In a side pocket of her bag, the deed was folded, paper edges frayed, the ink slightly smudged. Eleanor glanced up at Room 7's door again. A chill ran down her spine when she noticed a tiny brass plate at the bottom, engraved with what looked like initials that weren't her own, and beneath them, a faint scrawl. Do not open until the last Brooks remains. She swallowed, clutching the key tighter, and whispered, Only me, only me. The words lingered in the stale air long after Eleanor said them. She stood in the dark hallway of the motel for another moment, staring at the brass plate on Room 7, then slowly backed away. Whatever waited behind that door had waited for decades. Could wait one more night. The drive back to town took 23 minutes. Her Explorer rattled every time it crossed 45 miles per hour, and the check engine light had been glowing steadily since Christmas. Eleanor kept both hands on the wheel as dusk settled over the hills. The gas gauge hovered just above empty. She had enough fuel to get home and back to work tomorrow if she was careful. Maybe. When she pulled into the parking lot behind her apartment building, the security light above the rear entrance was still broken. It had been broken for 3 months. The landlord kept promising to replace it. The landlord also kept promising to repair the leak above her kitchen sink. Promises were cheaper than repairs. Upstairs, apartment 3B smelled faintly of old coffee and damp drywall. Eleanor set her purse on the counter and opened her banking app. $211.17. That was everything. Rent was due in 9 days. The electric bill sat unopened beside the toaster, stamped final notice in red letters. Next to it was a prescription refill reminder she had been postponing for nearly 3 weeks. She folded both papers and slid them beneath a stack of mail as if hiding them could buy more time. Then she opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk, a package of turkey slices, mustard, 2 apples. She closed the door gently. There was no point staring. At 63, Eleanor had become very good at making things last. A gallon of gas, a loaf of bread, pair of shoes, hope. She carried the cardboard box from the courthouse into the bedroom and placed it beside the bed. The same box she had carried out while her relatives laughed. She could still hear it. Her cousin Derek leaning back in his chair. $1 and a junk motel. Grandpa sure knew how to tell a joke. The room had erupted before the attorney could finish speaking. Not loud laughter. Worse, comfortable laughter. The kind people use when they assume everyone agrees. Eleanor remembered lowering her eyes and reaching for the coin. Nobody offered to help her carry the box. Nobody asked if she was okay. Her grandfather's silver dollar sat on the nightstand now, reflecting the yellow glow of a lamp with a crooked shade. She picked it up and turned it over. Harold Brooks. The engraving had nearly worn smooth from age. Unlike the others, Grandpa Harold had never treated her like a burden. He had never asked why she worked at the library instead of chasing bigger things. Never asked why she drove old cars. Never asked why she spent Saturdays helping seniors fill out paperwork at the community center. He simply remembered. A birthday card every year. A phone call every Christmas. Small things. The kind that mattered. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the deed again. The paper crackled softly. Brooks Sunset Motel. Parcel number 14-77B. She had read it 5 times already. Then her eyes stopped on something she hadn't noticed before. Near the bottom, beside a faded county seal, a second parcel number had been typed over the original one. The newer numbers were darker. Newer ink. Different typeface. Eleanor frowned. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a surveyor. But she had spent 27 years shelving local records at the library. She knew what old paperwork usually looked like. And this didn't look right. Someone had changed something. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The caller ID displayed Derek's name. She hesitated before answering. "You actually keeping that place?" he asked. "No greeting." "No. Congratulations." "For now." A pause. Then a laugh. "You should sell before it falls down on you." "Maybe. Trust me, Ellie. It's worthless." His voice remained friendly, almost too friendly. "Nobody wants that property." Eleanor glanced at the deed in her lap. "Then why are you calling me about it?" The silence that followed lasted only 2 seconds. But it was the longest 2 seconds of the day. After he hung up, Eleanor looked again at the altered parcel number. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the window. Inside, the silver dollar rested beside the key to room 7. For the first time since leaving the courthouse, she wondered if the motel wasn't the real inheritance at all. Maybe the inheritance was whatever someone had tried very hard to hide inside it. Maybe the inheritance was whatever someone had tried very hard to hide inside it. That thought stayed with Eleanor the next morning as she sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and the motel deed spread open beside her. Rain still tapped against the window. The silver dollar rested near her elbow. Room 7's key lay across the document like a bookmark waiting to be understood. She should have been at the library in an hour, shelving returned books and helping retirees find local records. Instead, she picked up the phone and called in for a personal day. She had only 3 left for the year. "Everything okay?" her supervisor asked. Eleanor looked at the deed. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. 45 minutes later, she was back at the county records office. A squat brick building that smelled faintly of paper, dust, and old air conditioning. The clerk behind the counter was a woman named Sandra, whom Eleanor had known for nearly 20 years. Sandra recognized her immediately. "Back already?" she asked with a sympathetic smile. News traveled fast in small towns. Eleanor slid the deed across the counter. "Can you pull the parcel records for this property?" Sandra glanced down at the paper. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not surprise. Not confusion. Something closer to caution. "The old Brooks Motel?" Eleanor nodded. Sandra hesitated before typing into her computer. "Most people would have sold that place yesterday." "Maybe." Sandra clicked through several screens. "Well, you're the owner now." Owner. The word felt strange. Eleanor couldn't remember the last time she had owned anything significant. Not a house. Not land. Not even a vehicle worth more than a few $1,000s. Just a rented apartment and a life spent making do. After several moments, Sandra disappeared into the back room and returned carrying a thick property folder. She placed it on the counter. These are the archived records. Eleanor opened it carefully. Tax documents, survey maps, inspection reports from decades ago. Most of it looked ordinary. Then something caught her attention. Several pages had been removed. Not torn out recently. Removed long ago. Cleanly. Deliberately. She looked up. Where are the missing files? Sandra frowned. Missing? Eleanor pointed to the sequence numbers. File 14-77B-21 jumped directly to 14-77B-25. For reports gone. Sandra leaned closer. That's strange. Eleanor kept turning pages. Near the back of the folder she found an old county map folded into quarters. When she opened it, a red circle appeared around the motel property. Not around the building itself. Around a section behind it. Nearly 3 acres extending beyond the visible lot. Was that always part of the property? She asked. Sandra adjusted her glasses. As far as I know. But she didn't sound certain. Then came the number that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. Unpaid taxes. She found the total handwritten on an old assessment notice. $7,412. More money than she could gather in months. Maybe years. Suddenly the motel felt less like an inheritance and more like an anchor tied around her ankle. Outside, she sat in her Explorer staring through the windshield. Her phone buzzed. Another call from Derek. This time she ignored it. 10 minutes later a text appeared. Don't waste time. Developers offering cash. You should take it before the county takes the place from you. Eleanor stared at the message. Then at the folder on the passenger seat. Then at the key. Most people would have taken the money. Most people would have listened when everyone called the motel worthless. Most people would have walked away from a building with broken windows, unpaid taxes, and missing records. But something about the missing pages bothered her more than the debt. Someone had removed them for a reason. When she returned to the motel that afternoon, a black SUV sat parked across the highway. The driver watched as she unlocked the front office. The moment she looked back, the vehicle pulled away. Eleanor stood alone beneath the faded motel sign, deed tucked under one arm and the key to room 7 in her hand, unaware that the place everyone laughed at had been waiting for her longer than she had been waiting for it. The place everyone laughed at had been waiting for her longer than she had been waiting for it. Eleanor stood beneath the faded motel sign for a long moment before stepping inside. The afternoon sky hung low and gray above the highway, and the wind pushed dry leaves across the cracked parking lot. There were 12 rooms in a single row, each door painted a color that had long ago surrendered to weather and time. Room 7 sat near the center, its number barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint. Eleanor slipped the key back into her coat pocket. Not yet. First, she needed to understand what exactly her grandfather had left behind. The front office door groaned when she pushed it open. A stale smell rolled out immediately. Dust, mildew, old wood. Beneath it all lingered something faintly familiar, like coffee that had been spilled years ago and never completely disappeared. Her boots stirred a thin cloud of dirt as she stepped inside. The reception counter remained where it had always been. Behind it stood a wall of wooden key slots, most of them empty. A few hooks still held brass tags covered in green corrosion. Sunlight slipped through cracked blinds and stretched across the floor in narrow bands. The office looked less like a building and more like a memory that had forgotten how to fade away. Eleanor set the property folder on the counter and removed her jacket. The silence felt heavy, not peaceful, watchful. She reached into her cardboard box and pulled out a flashlight, bottle of water, and 2 cans of chicken noodle soup she'd brought from home. It felt ridiculous and practical at the same time. She wasn't here to uncover secrets. She was here because she couldn't afford not to be. $7,000 in unpaid taxes had made that very clear. She moved carefully through the office. A wall calendar still hung beside a filing cabinet. October 1994. The page had never been turned. Nearby sat an old cash register covered in dust thick enough to preserve fingerprints. An overturned coffee mug rested beside it. The motel's logo was still visible on the side. Brooks Sunset Motel. Vacancy. Cable TV. Air conditioning. The promises of another era. Eleanor brushed dust from the counter with her sleeve. Beneath it, someone had carved initials into the wood. Hobby. Harold Brooks. Her grandfather. For a moment she could almost picture him standing there, reading glasses low on his nose, coffee in one hand, smiling at travelers passing through. The image disappeared as quickly as it arrived. She walked deeper into the office and found the breaker panel. Surprisingly, the box wasn't rusted shut. After several attempts, she managed to reset a few switches. Nothing happened at first. Then, somewhere above her, an ancient fluorescent light flickered once, twice. A weak buzz echoed through the ceiling before darkness returned. Good enough, she muttered. It was more life than the building had shown in years. As evening approached, the temperature dropped. Eleanor unfolded an old blanket from her Explorer and spread it across the least damaged section of floor behind the reception desk. Her knees protested as she sat down. She opened one can of soup using a pocket can opener and ate slowly while studying the motel map mounted on the wall. Most of the rooms appeared ordinary, but one thing caught her attention. Room 7 was slightly larger than the others, only by a few feet. Easy to miss unless you looked closely. She stood and carried her flashlight outside. The hallway stretched before her, lined with identical doors. The beam swept across chipped paint, broken screens, and cracked concrete. When she reached room 7, she crouched beside the frame. The lock itself looked old. Too old. Yet the screws securing it to the door were newer than everything around it. Someone had replaced them years after the motel closed. Eleanor frowned. Then she noticed something else. The wall beside room 7 sounded different. She tapped lightly with her knuckles. Solid. She moved 2 feet farther down and tapped again. Hollow. A dull echo answered from somewhere behind the wall. Eleanor froze. The sound faded. Then, from the other side of the corridor, something scraped softly across the floor as if a piece of furniture had been dragged a few inches through the dust. The scraping sound lasted only a second. Then silence returned. Eleanor stood motionless in the corridor, flashlight aimed toward the far end of the motel. Nothing moved. No shadows crossed the floor. No door shifted. After nearly a minute, she exhaled slowly and lowered the light. Probably a raccoon, she said aloud. The empty hallway offered no argument. Still, she glanced once more toward room 7 before returning to the office. The building wasn't going to reveal its secrets in a single afternoon. What it desperately needed was work. The next morning began with a trip to the hardware store. Eleanor spent $48.73 on contractor trash bags, work gloves, duct tape, a box of screws, 2 sheets of heavy plastic, a push broom, and a tarp large enough to cover part of the leaking roof. As she handed over her debit card, she mentally calculated what remained in her account. Not much. Certainly not enough to make a motel operational, but enough to keep going another week. Maybe 2. By noon, she was back at the property. The sun had broken through the clouds, illuminating every flaw the building possessed. Weeds had swallowed portions of the parking lot. Window frames sagged. Gutters hung loose from the roofline. Eleanor pulled on her gloves and got to work. Glass first. She swept shattered pieces from the office floor into a dustpan, the broom scraping rhythmically across concrete. Then came decades of dirt. Dust coated every surface. Dead insects filled corners. A family of mice had claimed part of the supply closet. Hour after hour, she worked in silence. Her shoulders ached. Her knees complained every time she bent down. The arthritis in her hands flared beneath the gloves. But there was something strangely comforting about physical labor. Problems became visible. Solutions became measurable. Unlike unpaid bills and family disappointments, a dirty floor could actually become clean. By late afternoon, she had cleared enough space behind the reception desk to set up a folding chair and a small camping stove. Water heated slowly in a dented kettle while she examined the roof leak she'd noticed earlier. Using an old extension ladder she found behind the building, she climbed carefully onto the roof and stretched the tarp across the worst section. The wind fought her every step. Twice she nearly lost her balance. But by sunset the tarp held. Rain wouldn't be getting in there tonight. It wasn't much. Still, it was progress. Back inside, she heated canned soup and sat at the counter while golden evening light filtered through the dusty windows. The motel looked marginally less abandoned than it had yesterday. She found herself imagining what her grandfather would think. Whether he'd approve. Whether he'd laugh at her attempts to rescue a building everyone else had written off. Her gaze drifted toward a small drawer built into the reception counter. She had tried opening it earlier. It wouldn't budge. Now she pulled again. Locked. Strange. Most of the motel had been left unsecured. Why lock a single drawer? Eleanor searched for a key but found none. Eventually she used a flat screwdriver from her toolbox and gently pried the warped wood away from the frame. The drawer opened with a sharp crack. Inside sat only a handful of yellowed receipts bound together with a rubber band that had long since turned brittle. She almost threw them away. Then she noticed the dates. Most were from the early 1990s. Motel supplies, utility payments, routine expenses. Nothing unusual. But one receipt stood out. It wasn't from a supplier. It was handwritten. Cash received from J. Mercer. Room 7. No amount listed. No explanation. Eleanor frowned. Maybe J. Mercer had been a long-term guest. Maybe her grandfather simply forgot to complete the paperwork. A perfectly ordinary explanation. Then she turned the receipt over. Written on the back was a phone number. Beneath it, in her grandfather's handwriting, were 4 words. Not for county records. The room suddenly felt colder. Outside, wind rattled the loose motel sign. Inside, Eleanor looked down at the receipt again and noticed something else. The paper wasn't folded naturally. It had been wrapped around a small brass key that was no longer there. The paper wasn't folded naturally. It had been wrapped around a small brass key that was no longer there. Eleanor sat behind the reception counter long after sunset, turning the receipt over beneath the beam of her flashlight. The handwritten note bothered her more than the missing key. Not for county records. It sounded less like a reminder and more like a warning. Eventually the cold drove her home. By morning, a steady wind had swept across the highway, rattling the motel sign and scattering leaves across the parking lot. Eleanor arrived carrying a thermos of coffee and a grocery sack containing peanut butter crackers, 2 apples, and the last pair of work gloves she owned. The motel looked slightly less abandoned than it had a few days earlier. Not better, just occupied. Someone was trying. She spent the first hour hauling debris from the far end of the property. An old mattress, rusted lawn chairs, a broken television with rabbit ear antennas. Sweat dampened the collar of her shirt despite the cool weather. Around mid-morning, she heard the sound of a pickup truck pulling into the lot. Eleanor straightened and turned. An older man climbed out carrying a cardboard tray with 2 coffees balanced on top. He wore faded coveralls stained with grease and a cap advertising a tractor company that no longer existed. "Figured you'd need this," he said. Eleanor recognized him immediately. Frank Delaney, the retired mechanic who owned the repair shop 3 miles down the road. They'd exchanged greetings around town for years, but never much more. He handed her one of the coffees. "You look like somebody trying to clean an ocean with a teaspoon." Eleanor laughed despite herself. "Feels about right." Frank studied the motel for a moment. "Your grandfather would have hated seeing it like this." The comment caught her attention. Most people only talked about the motel's condition. Not Harold. "You knew him well?" Frank nodded. "Long enough." He walked toward the office and stopped near the reception counter. His eyes landed on the carved initials Eleanor had uncovered beneath the dust. "Hubby." His expression softened. He carved those himself back in the 70s. Eleanor followed him inside. The office smelled less like mildew now and more like old wood warming in sunlight. She pointed toward the receipt lying on the counter. "Did you ever know someone named J. Mercer? Frank's eyes moved to the paper. For a second, something flickered across his face. Recognition. Then it vanished. That's an old name. Who was he? Frank took a sip of coffee instead of answering immediately. Some people checked into this place and stayed a night. Some stayed a year. Harold didn't always ask questions. Eleanor noticed the deflection. You knew him. Everybody knew somebody who knew him. Another deflection. Frank set his coffee down and walked toward the wall of key hooks. His fingers brushed one empty slot near the center. Your grandfather helped a lot of folks around here. By renting rooms? Frank gave a small smile. Sometimes. His gaze drifted toward room 7 visible through the office window. The smile disappeared. Sometimes he helped people disappear for a while. Eleanor frowned. Disappear? Frank immediately shook his head. Bad choice of words. He looked away. Too quickly. The silence stretched between them. Outside, a truck roared past on the highway. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Why does everybody stop talking when room 7 comes up? Frank's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might leave without answering. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a rusted brass tag no larger than a matchbook. He placed it gently on the counter. Number 7 was stamped into the metal. On the back was a familiar set of initials. HB found that in my toolbox 20 years ago, Frank said quietly. Never figured out how it got there. Eleanor picked it up. The edges were worn smooth from years of handling. Why keep it? Frank looked toward the motel rooms again. Because some things don't belong to the people who find them. He headed for the door, then stopped with one hand on the frame. Without turning around, he said, If you start finding answers in this place, don't assume they're about money. Then he walked back to his truck and drove away, leaving Eleanor alone with the brass tag in her hand and the growing realization that the motel wasn't merely an abandoned property. It was the last place in town where her grandfather's silence was still speaking. The brass tag felt heavier in Eleanor's hand than it should have, almost like it had absorbed decades of silence. She moved toward the back of the motel, flashlight in one hand, the tag and the room 7 key clutched in the other. Her boots crunched against the gravel under the hallway windows, and the wind rattled the remaining blinds, throwing slats of pale sunlight onto the worn floorboards. She crouched beside room 7 and tapped lightly along the base of the wall. Hollow. Her heart skipped a beat. She ran her fingers along the molding, comparing it to the other rooms. Clean cuts here, mismatched paint there. Someone had patched this wall more recently than any of the others. A faint groove in the floor caught her eye, a narrow line stretching from beneath the baseboard toward the far corner. She knelt and traced it with her fingers. Dust had settled in a pattern around it, but the groove itself was too precise, too deliberate. Eleanor rose and followed it. The sound of rain began softly on the tin roof, a gentle patter, but her focus remained on the subtle signs. She placed her flashlight against the wall and noticed the electrical panel nearby. The paint on its edges was newer, brighter than the rest of the faded office. She crouched and compared the panel to the breaker box she had reset earlier. Something didn't line up. A small screw on the corner seemed turned differently than the rest, and the door creaked strangely when nudged. Her breath caught. Could this be nothing? She tried to reason. Maybe a repairman had done a quick patch. Years ago, maybe it was nothing. Then she leaned against the freezer unit in the corner to steady herself. The wall behind it sounded hollow, distinctly different from the surrounding surfaces. A muffled scraping echoed softly, like a mouse or a loose panel shifting. Eleanor froze. The old fluorescent light overhead buzzed and flickered. She knelt beside the floorboards and pressed her hands against a section that looked newer than the rest. The wood gave a hollow thunk when she tapped. She pulled her flashlight along the crack, revealing a small, almost imperceptible notch, carved intentionally. The rain on the roof grew louder, dripping rhythmically into the gutters, a natural pause in the tension, but Eleanor didn't move. Her fingers explored the floor further and found a tiny dent at the edge of the molding, like the mark of a tool pressed repeatedly over time. She crouched back by the base of the wall, shining the light along the corner. The panel beside room 7 shifted slightly when she nudged it again, revealing a sliver of darkness just large enough to suggest a cavity beyond. Eleanor's stomach clenched. A silent line of reasoning had formed. The groove in the floor, the newer paint, the oddly turned screw, the hollow wall. Someone had built a hidden space here. Not randomly, not carelessly. Someone had intended for it to remain unseen, waiting for the right person to find it. She knelt longer, running the light along the gap, noticing dust that had settled unevenly, a shadow that shifted when the beam moved. And there it was, a tiny opening beneath the panel, just wide enough to slip a finger through. Eleanor's breath caught, and her hand hovered over the narrow crevice, realizing for the first time that whatever her grandfather had left wasn't just room 7, but a secret meticulously protected within it. The realization settled over Eleanor like a weight. Whatever her grandfather had left wasn't simply hidden. It had been protected. Carefully. Deliberately. She remained crouched beside the wall for nearly a minute, listening to the rain drum softly against the roof while her fingertips rested near the narrow opening. The gap was barely half an inch wide, hidden beneath years of paint and dust. Most people would never have noticed it. Most people would never have spent days cleaning a motel everyone else considered worthless. Eleanor reached into her toolbox and retrieved a flat screwdriver. Her movements were slow, almost respectful. The old panel resisted at first. Paint cracked. Wood groaned. One rusted screw snapped loose and rolled across the floor with a metallic click that echoed through the empty room. She froze, listening. Nothing. Only the rain and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Carefully, she worked the panel free. A section roughly 2 feet wide shifted outward. Dust spilled into the beam of her flashlight. Behind it sat a narrow cavity built between the wall studs. Not large enough for a person. Just large enough to hide something important. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Inside rested a rectangular metal box about the size of a shoebox. It was coated in dust but surprisingly free of rust. Someone had wrapped it in oilcloth before placing it there. She lifted it out with both hands and carried it to the reception counter. The box was heavier than expected. Her grandfather's brass room 7 tag lay beside it. For several seconds she simply stared. Then she noticed the lock. Not complicated. Not expensive. But familiar. Her eyes dropped to the small brass key she had found mentioned on the receipt. The missing key. Her stomach tightened. She opened her purse and removed the old motel keyring. Most of the keys were unrelated, but one tiny brass key hung among them. She had assumed it belonged to an office cabinet. Slowly, she inserted it into the box. The lock clicked immediately. Eleanor sat down hard in the reception chair. For a moment she didn't move. Then she opened the lid. The smell hit first. Old paper. Dust. A faint trace of machine oil. Inside were 3 bundles tied with faded blue string. A stack of letters. Several Polaroid photographs. And a small black journal with worn leather corners. No cash. No gold. No deed to a fortune. Just paper. Yet her hands trembled anyway. She picked up the journal first. The cover had no title. Inside, the first page contained only a date. April 14th, 1994. Beneath it was her grandfather's handwriting. Smaller than she remembered. More hurried. If you're reading this, it means the wrong people didn't find it first. Eleanor swallowed. She turned the page. Most entries were brief. Names. Dates. Room numbers. Notes written in shorthand she didn't fully understand. Some entries listed no last names at all. Just initials. Others had addresses from different states. Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia. A few pages contained references to cash payments. Not large amounts.
$20, $50,
$100. Enough to help someone survive. Not enough to attract attention. She opened the first bundle of letters. Every envelope had already been opened. Many were addressed to Harold Brooks. Some contained thank you notes. Others simply said things like "we made it safely" or "the kids are doing well now." One letter made her pause. The signature at the bottom read J. Mercer. The same name from the receipt. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. She unfolded the letter completely. Most of it was ordinary gratitude. Then she reached the final sentence. "Thank you for keeping your promise about the girl." Eleanor read it twice. The girl. No explanation followed. No name. Just those words. She quickly set the letter aside and picked up one of the Polaroids. The image had faded badly. A young woman stood beside a motel room door holding the hand of a little girl. The date stamped in the corner read June 1994. Eleanor's breath caught. She looked closer, then closer still. The child in the photograph wore a small yellow jacket and held a stuffed rabbit with one missing ear. Eleanor knew that rabbit. She had slept with it for years. Written on the back of the photograph, in her grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words that made the room seem suddenly smaller. For Eleanor, when she's ready. The June 1994 Polaroid rested in Eleanor's palm as if it had weight beyond its size. She set it gently on the reception counter beside the journal, tracing the outline of the little girl's yellow jacket with her fingertip. The faint scent of old soap and varnish rose from the photo, mingling with the dust and musty air of the motel. Eleanor opened the journal again, flipping to a page farther in. The handwriting was smaller here, hurried, as if Harold Brooks had squeezed thoughts onto every inch of paper. Paid hospital bills for ML family. Keep them safe. Rent covered through December for room 3. Check in for J. Mercer, do not question. Eleanor traced each letter, feeling the pressure and ink bleed into the paper, the physical imprint of decisions made decades ago. Next, she unfolded a set of letters bound in thin blue string. One was addressed to a local church, thanking the pastor for letting Harold hide a few children in the basement overnight during a storm. Another, an envelope never mailed, contained a prescription receipt for asthma medication. A patient's initials matching a family she remembered from town gossip. Her chest tightened. Her grandfather had acted quietly, deliberately, anonymously, carrying burdens no one knew about. Ledger pages, smeared with coffee stains, listed names and small payments. Room 5, utilities covered, Mrs. P. $22.50. Room 7, deposit held, LB, do not disturb. Eleanor recognized her own initials beside a notation. Future, observe quietly. A chill ran down her spine. She placed a hand over the page. The numbers, dates, and letters were mundane on the surface, but together they created a lattice of protection, a silent network she had never been told about. Somewhere behind the counter, the faint hum of the old refrigerator shivered. She could hear the wind whispering against the gaps in the window frames, echoing like a faint voice. Eleanor compared the Polaroid with the ledger. The little girl's stuffed rabbit matched an entry Harold had made. The same initials. A name she recognized. Her grandfather had been orchestrating a safety net for people, for families, for her, without ever speaking a word. Then she found a receipt from the local hardware store tucked between the pages. Purchased lock repair materials, room 7. The date corresponded to weeks after the girl in the photograph had stayed there. Her breath caught. Someone had been actively maintaining access to that room. Someone had planned for this moment, even before she arrived. Eleanor felt her fingers tighten around the photo, the journal, the letters. Harold Brooks had not abandoned her. He had been leaving breadcrumbs, preparing her to uncover a truth that no one else had dared touch. Outside, a vehicle idled softly on the highway, distant enough to be ignored, but she imagined it as an observer, a shadowed reminder that some were watching, that some had always been watching. She traced her name once more in the ledger and whispered, "He knew. He always knew." The realization settled over her like sunlight through dusty blinds. She wasn't forgotten. She was being guided, step by step, toward a secret only she could claim. She wasn't forgotten. She was being guided, step by step, toward a secret only she could claim. The thought followed Eleanor through the next 48 hours. She slept little. Every spare minute outside her library shifts was spent at the motel, sorting papers across the reception counter beneath the glow of a borrowed desk lamp. The journal sat open beside the ledger. Photographs were arranged in careful rows. Letters occupied 3 separate piles. By the third evening, a pattern had emerged. Harold Brooks hadn't simply been helping people. He had been documenting something, protecting something. Eleanor found herself staring repeatedly at the same entries. Certain names appeared again and again over nearly 20 years. Families who arrived suddenly. Families who left quietly. Payments never collected. Deposits returned. Utility bills paid by Harold himself. It wasn't charity alone. It was stewardship. Late Friday afternoon, she drove back to the county records office carrying copies of the ledger pages in a manila folder. Sandra looked up from her desk as Eleanor approached. "You look like somebody chasing ghosts," she said. Eleanor managed a tired smile. "I think I'm chasing paperwork." Sandra laughed softly and disappeared into the archive room. 20 minutes later, she returned with several property maps and historical parcel records. Together, they spread the documents across a long table. Eleanor compared them to the motel deed, then compared them again. "Wait," she said. Sandra leaned closer. The original motel parcel ended at the rear fence line. The current parcel extended nearly 3 additional acres beyond it. Forested land. Unused land. Land everyone assumed belonged to the county. Yet every historical survey showed the same thing. Harold had owned it all along. "That can't be right," Sandra murmured. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Then why is it?" Sandra studied the maps carefully. "Because someone never recorded the subdivision transfer." The words landed like a stone. Eleanor immediately thought of the altered parcel number on her deed. The missing pages. The missing files. Someone had tried to separate the motel from the land behind it. Someone had almost succeeded. Back at the motel, she compared the maps with the red-circled county survey she'd found earlier. The circle wasn't around the motel building at all. It surrounded the additional acreage. At first glance, the property seemed ordinary. Dense trees.
Une veine terrain.
No structures. Then she discovered an envelope tucked into the back cover of Harold's journal. Thick cream-colored paper. A local attorney's letterhead from 1996. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The contents were brief. Confirmation that Harold Brooks had declined multiple purchase offers for the land easement bordering State Route 18. Future transportation corridor. Significant projected value increase. Preserve ownership until trust conditions are met. Eleanor read the sentence twice. Trust conditions. Her grandfather had never mentioned a trust. Yet there it was. Legal documentation. Official signatures. County stamps. Suddenly the motel looked very different. Not valuable because of hidden treasure. Valuable because Harold had deliberately protected land that would eventually become critical to the entire area. Land connected to roads, development, and ownership rights. Land someone clearly wanted. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Ms. Brooks." The voice was smooth, professional. "My name is Richard Cole. I represent Horizon Development Group." Eleanor's stomach tightened immediately. "How can I help you?" "We've become aware you've inherited the Brooks Sunset Motel property. We'd like to discuss purchasing it." "Not interested," polite chuckle answered. "You may not fully understand what you're holding." Eleanor glanced at the maps spread across the counter. "Maybe not. The building is unsafe. The taxes alone could become overwhelming. We're only trying to help." There it was. The same phrase people used whenever they wanted something. "We're only trying to help." Eleanor thanked him and ended the call. 15 minutes later, a black SUV rolled slowly past the motel entrance. The same model she'd noticed days earlier. It didn't stop. It didn't need to. It simply reminded her that someone was paying attention. That evening, as sunset painted the parking lot gold, Eleanor opened the attorney's envelope one final time. A second document had been folded behind the first. She hadn't noticed it before. It was a trust amendment bearing Harold Brooks's signature. Trust amendment, journal, photographs, and original letters were no longer stored in the wall cavity. She had moved everything to a small fireproof lockbox hidden in her apartment closet. What remained at the motel were copies. She trusted her grandfather. She did not trust coincidence. That afternoon, a certified letter arrived. The envelope carried the logo of a law firm from the state capital. Eleanor opened it carefully. Inside was a formal notice questioning the validity of the property's transfer. According to the letter, newly discovered inconsistencies in county parcel records suggested a possible clerical error affecting ownership boundaries. Pending review, certain portions of the land might be subject to dispute. Eleanor read the document twice. Then a third time. The language sounded professional, reasonable, temporary. Yet every paragraph pointed toward the same outcome. Delay, confusion, pressure. She immediately noticed something else. The filing date on the complaint was only 48 hours after Horizon Development had contacted her. That wasn't coincidence either. By evening, Derek arrived in person. He stood outside the motel office wearing an expensive jacket and carrying a folder beneath one arm. His smile appeared friendly, practiced. Mind if we talk? Eleanor remained behind the counter. Depends. Derek nodded as though he understood. Look, nobody's trying to take anything from you. The sentence arrived exactly as she expected. Then why are lawyers involved? His smile tightened slightly. Because Grandpa made a mistake. Eleanor almost laughed. The man who ran this property for 30 years suddenly made a mistake? Derek opened his folder. Inside sat a purchase agreement. Horizon Development was offering a substantial amount of money. More money than Eleanor had ever seen attached to her name. Enough to pay the taxes. Enough to buy a small house. Enough to make walking away seem practical. You don't understand what you're holding, Derek said softly. Exactly, Eleanor replied. Neither do you. For the first time, irritation slipped through his polished expression. This property belongs to the family legacy. Eleanor stared at him. The same cousin who had called it junk. The same cousin who laughed when she received it. Now he spoke about legacy. When Derek finally left, he forgot one sheet of paper inside the folder. Eleanor noticed it only after his truck disappeared down the highway. At first glance it looked ordinary. A survey copy, parcel maps, legal descriptions. Then her eyes landed on a signature near the bottom. Harold Brooks. She immediately reached for the trust amendment from the lockbox copy she kept at the motel. The signatures looked similar, but not identical. Harold's real signature slanted slightly upward at the end. This one curved downward. Tiny difference. Easy to miss. Impossible to ignore once seen. Eleanor photographed the page with her phone. Then she called Frank. I think somebody forged something, she said. Silence answered for several seconds. Finally Frank spoke. Then don't tell anybody what else you've found. After the call ended, Eleanor locked the office and stood alone in the parking lot as darkness settled across the motel. Beyond the highway, headlights glowed briefly through the trees. Someone was watching again. The difference now was that Eleanor finally understood why. And hidden safely away was a photograph, a journal, and a signature comparison that the people coming after her didn't know existed. And hidden safely away was a photograph, a journal, and a signature comparison that the people coming after her didn't know existed. 3 weeks later, the confrontation arrived. Not in a courtroom with television cameras. Not in some dramatic public hearing. It happened in the county administration building, in a conference room with beige walls, fluorescent lights, and a long oak table scarred by decades of paperwork. The room smelled faintly of coffee and copier toner. Horizon Development's attorney sat at one end. Derek sat beside him. Across the table, 2 county officials reviewed maps and land records. Eleanor arrived carrying a weathered leather satchel. The same satchel she had used for years at the library. No expensive attorney accompanied her. No legal team. Just Frank sitting quietly in the back row and a folder containing everything her grandfather had hidden. The hearing began exactly how Eleanor expected. Calm voices, professional smiles. The attorney presented the alleged clerical errors, parcel discrepancies, ownership confusion, administrative corrections. Every sentence made it sound reasonable, temporary, necessary. Then came the real objective. Given the uncertainty surrounding these records, the attorney said smoothly, the most practical solution would be transferring the disputed acreage into escrow until proper ownership can be determined. Translation: remove it from Eleanor's control. Derek nodded sympathetically. We're only trying to protect Grandpa's legacy. Eleanor almost smiled. The phrase sounded different now. 1 month ago they called it junk. Now they called it legacy. The county administrator turned toward her. Mrs. Brooks, do you have anything you'd like to add? Eleanor opened her satchel. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from age and exhaustion. She placed a single document on the table. The trust amendment. The room remained quiet. The attorney glanced at it briefly. We've already reviewed that document. Not all of it, Eleanor replied. Then she slid forward the original attorney letter she had found hidden inside the journal. The one confirming Harold's refusal to sell the easement land and referencing trust conditions. The attorney's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. One county official adjusted his glasses and read more carefully. The room grew quieter. Eleanor reached into her folder again. This time she placed 2 signatures side by side. Harold's verified trust signature. The signature from the survey document Derek had accidentally left behind. They don't match, she said simply. No accusation. No speech. Just fact. The county clerk leaned forward. The attorney immediately began explaining. Variations occur. Age affects handwriting. Copies distort detail. Reasonable explanations. Until Eleanor placed the next item on the table. The original journal. Several pages marked with dates matching the disputed transactions. Harold's handwriting remained remarkably consistent. Upward slant. Distinct lettering. The forged signature did not. The attorney stopped speaking. For the first time, uncertainty entered the room. Then Frank stood. Slowly. Quietly. I'd like to make a statement. Every eye turned toward him. He removed an old photograph from his wallet. The edges were worn soft from decades of handling. It showed Harold standing beside several local families behind the motel. One county official immediately recognized one of the people pictured. Another recognized a second. Families still living in town. Families Harold had helped. Harold never intended to sell that land, Frank said. Everybody knew it. Silence settled over the room. The kind that arrives when people realize they're no longer debating theory. They're confronting truth. Then Eleanor revealed the final piece. The journal entry dated April 14th, 1994. The first page. If you're reading this, it means the wrong people didn't find it first. She slid the page forward. Beneath the sentence sat a notarized witness seal that nobody had noticed before. An official authentication. The county administrator stared at it for several long seconds. The pen in his hand stopped moving. Across the table, Derek's confidence disappeared. Horizon's attorney removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The motel. Room 7. The journal. The photographs. The supposedly worthless inheritance had become the evidence itself. At last, the county administrator closed the folder and looked directly at Eleanor. Mrs. Brooks, he said quietly, it appears your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. For the first time since the will reading, the room listened when she spoke. And as the meeting ended, Eleanor realized the fight for ownership was nearly over. The harder question was only beginning. If Harold had protected this place for 30 years, what responsibility came with inheriting it? The courthouse doors closed behind her, leaving a quiet stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor stepped out with the original trust documents clutched in her hands, the same journal, the photographs, and the brass key that had begun this long journey. The county clerk had stamped the deed as fully recognized, the petition from Horizon Development formally dismissed, and Derek had left, pale and quiet, his assertions of family property silenced by evidence. The ledger, once a ledger of numbers and obligations, now stood as proof of careful stewardship, a record of decades where her grandfather had quietly protected families, neighbors, and even Eleanor herself. Outside, The wind carried the scent of rain-soaked asphalt, and for the first time, the motel looked alive in its stillness. She inserted the key into room 7's lock one last time. Turned smoothly.
No rust, no hesitaschen.
She pushed the door open, sunlight streaming across the floorboards, illuminating dust motes that sparkled like tiny stars. Eleanor carried her grandfather's photograph from the reception counter and set it in the center of the room. The journal rested beside it, the pages now readable and honored, the handwriting no longer secret. She unlocked the office door, hung the Brooks Sunset Motel sign back above the entrance, and straightened the letters on the counter. The community slowly returned, drawn not by profit but by trust. Frank appeared with tools and a smile. Neighbors offered supplies. Families helped clear debris. Eleanor led the first visitors into the rooms, giving keys to those who needed shelter, explaining that Harold's vision had always been about safety, not money. The motel's broken roof was patched, the floors swept, and a modest fund established to maintain it. At night, she slept in room 7, the brass key on the nightstand, the silver dollar beside it, and the journal open on the dresser. The wind rattled gently against the tin roof, a lullaby of continuity. In that quiet, Eleanor finally understood. Every letter, every ledger page, every Polaroid, every deed had been proof that she had never been worthless. The motel, once dismissed as junk, now embodied her grandfather's trust, her family's legacy, and the proof of her own resilience. As she looked out across the parking lot, the first morning sunlight illuminated the faded sign, the doors, the repaired windows, and the tiny brass tag hanging from the counter. She touched the key, feeling its weight, and smiled faintly. What everyone had scorned, what the world had counted as trash, was in fact a treasure that had waited for the right person. Patient, persistent, and deserving enough to finally open it.